Welcome to Shaken Not Burned, a cocktail of solutions for a sustainable future. I'm Felicia Jackson.
And I am Giulia Bottaro. Each week we interview experts to talk about parts of the sustainable transition and what you and your business need to know to succeed.
Sustainability is complex and constantly evolving, and it can be hard for a business to adapt and remain competitive.
We are here to help you learn all about the changing economy and the ongoing transition.
So join us as we explore the concepts and the tools you need to plot a course for a sustainable future. Hello and welcome back to Shaken Not Burned, a cocktail of solutions for a sustainable future. In order to understand what solutions are going to be most effective in addressing the challenges we face, from climate change to nature loss and beyond, it's critical that we actually understand the problem. One of the key tools in our arsenal of understanding is climate science. It's the study of the Earth's climate system, and that means all of its components, processes, and how they interact. Climate scientists actually investigate how that system operates, how it's changed over time, and how human activities, whether that's burning fossil fuels or deforestation, actually impact the climate. It covers a range of disciplines, from meteorology to oceanography, from glaciology to paleoclimatology. It helps us understand the causes and consequences of climate change, particularly the impact of human activity. The challenge is that many of us don't really understand climate science and what it is, what it means and what it tells us. And that lack of understanding underpins a growing wave of climate misinformation and disinformation and supports the increasingly polarized politicization of climate and sustainability action. And that's a problem for all of us. Today, we're lucky enough to be joined by a global expert in the field of climate science, Professor Mark Maslin, Professor of Earth Systems Science at UCL. He's the UNFCCC's designated lead for UCL, and he's been working in the field for years. So thank you for joining us today, Mark, and welcome to the show.
Absolute pleasure. And I have to say that introduction makes me feel really old. Thank you.
It's unintentional, although I do know how you feel. Anyway, let's kick off by talking about what climate science tells us about the world and why it matters.
So climate science is the way we actually record every aspect of the climate system, whether it is ice sheets, whether it's the oceans, whether it's our land, whether it's our forest, whether it's the amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And what we have seen, and this is science that goes back 150 years, is that the amount of CO2 and other greenhouse gases in the atmosphere are increasing. Now, these gases are important, and it was Eunice Foote back in the 80s. She was an American female scientist who did a very simple experiment, one that you and I can do. She put 2 test tubes out in her garden on a sunny summer's day. One was filled with normal air, and the other one with carbon dioxide. Both had thermometers in. And what she observed and recorded was the one with CO2 warmed up quicker, got to a much higher temperature, and then took a lot longer to cool down. She discovered the greenhouse effect. And then 5 years later in London, John Tyndall at the Royal Institution built a thermocouple to actually measure that effect. And what he found was the most important greenhouse gas in the atmosphere is water vapor, which is why he realized that Earth remains nice and warm for life. But then that's followed by things like carbon dioxide, methane, and we now know things like nitrous oxides, those really nasty things like CFCs and SF6. We've been pumping greenhouse gases into the atmosphere since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. And what we've seen is that causes warming. And we've just had notice from the Copernica system in Europe that we now have hit 1.6 degrees Celsius warmer than pre-industrial times. This has smashed through the target that was set 10 years ago by Paris, where the great leaders of the world sat down and said, look, our aspirational target is to keep global warming to just 1.5, and if we miss that, keep it below 2 degrees. Well, we're well on our way to 2 degrees now.
That's a really terrifying thing when the way I understand it is that we're supposed to be, on the path to net zero by 2030. That gives us 5 years to get back on track. What does it actually mean when we talk about the fact that the global average temperature is now 1.6 degrees above the average, or really the original baseline? What sort of impact is that going to have?
So the big problem with the average temperature, whether it's 1.4, 1.5 or 1.6, is it's very esoteric. People go, actually, if my room's 1.5 degrees warmer or cooler, that doesn't really make me feel much different. But when it comes to a planet, it changes all the dynamics. And so we're seeing more and more extreme weather events. So, for example, wildfires in LA, which are 3 months after the fire season supposedly should end. We've had massive floods in Spain. We've had heat waves across sort of like Asia and, of course, Africa. And these extreme weather events, which we as climatologists track, are becoming more frequent and more extreme with every single year. And that's impacting on people's health. It's causing people to die, and it's interrupting things like the economy, and simple things like getting food from one place to another is becoming more and more difficult. So it's interrupting our lifestyle and our economy and the way we live. And this is the problem, is that 1.6 is just a measure of how bad is it. And we know that 1.7 is going to be much worse than 1.6. And so it's a shorthand that we climatologists use to say, guys, you've missed the limit. You really need to go on net zero. And that net zero is an interesting concept because people go, what do you mean by net zero? So what we want, and this is the incredible change that happened in Paris 10 years ago, when the French were magnificent at getting all the countries in the world to agree to limit climate change. And the net zero came out because instead of different countries saying, oh, I'll drop by 50% and I'll drop by 90%, the consensus was everybody has to get to zero by the middle of the century, preferably 2050. That's the developed and developing countries. There wasn't any space left anymore for people to go, I can still pollute. And what's interesting is the net. The net is because we know there's certain parts of the global system that will be very difficult to stop emitting greenhouse gases. Agriculture, aviation, concrete manufacturing, just to name 3 really difficult industries. And so the idea is the net. The net is that you reduce your emissions as much as possible. And when you get to that last hard bit, then you're allowed to suck CO2 out of the atmosphere by reforestation, rewilding, or doing very positive things by actually directly capturing it from the air. And that offsets your debt. And that's why we talk about net zero. If we get to net zero by 2050, we could keep the climate to about 1.5 degrees. But we'd have to halve our emissions by 2030, which is 5 years' time.
And seems very unlikely.
We haven't yet flattened the curve. And I know that's going back to sort of like terminology from COVID, but no, CO2 and other greenhouse gases are still rising. Interestingly enough, CO2 has started to come down, but the other greenhouse gases such as methane are still rising. So we haven't started the downward trip yet, even though we have slowed the amount that's coming out.
Right. Now, I think one of the things that's really important here, you mentioned this idea that 1.5 is bad, 1.6 is worse, 1.7 is worse. What exactly is it that happens? Because I understand that the way in which the climate operates gets disrupted, it becomes more volatile. But I think one of the things that people struggle to understand is exactly how it happens. So one of the things I was reading about the LA fires is that because the world is getting warmer, there's greater uptake of water in clouds, which means you get worse floods. But then when there's a drought, it takes more moisture out of the plants. So actually that's what set up California for the fire, because of course there was a massive drought, then there was 2 years of rain, followed by a massive drought. And you've got all these cycles of things working differently. What is it about climate science that explains what's happening with weather?
Okay. So lots of different aspects there. So the first thing is you're putting more energy into the system. You're heating it up, and therefore everything gets a little bit more dynamic and a little bit more chaotic and variable. So if we take precipitation, so rainfall, as you said, when you heat up the planet, you get more evaporation. So that means there's more moisture in the air, which means when it does rain, it rains heavier and more intense. So for example, if you take Dubai, last year in July, they had nearly 2 years of rain that fell in 2.5 hours, which wiped out the country in many ways. It's made sure that the airport wasn't functioning for over a week, and many people were flooded in a desert country. If we then look at, say, California, because of all that moisture has been taken out of the soil, it's incredibly dry. But you have lots of vegetation because, of course, you have these floods and therefore you have this blooming, which then gets very dry, and then it can be fuel for fire. And I'll give you an example. So the fire season in California is March to October.
Mm-hmm.
But since October, they have had 0.5 centimeter of rain. That's basically your thumbnail, okay, of rain in over 3 months. So complete drought there. And so therefore, when you have this huge wind coming down from the mountains, which gusting up to 100 miles an hour, any spark is then fanned. And this is why you've got these huge fire tornadoes, sort of like massive fires, which there's nothing we as humans can do to actually prevent them apart from retreat and try to actually contain. And even that's very difficult. And I have to say, my heart goes out to the firefighters because they are having that job, which is nigh impossible, but they do it anyway.
I mean, that's one of the things that's remarkable is how people do respond to these crises. But one of the things I struggle with personally is this notion that we do understand what risks we're running. We do have an understanding. Climate science can show us that these things are more likely to happen, but we don't seem to be preparing for them. And one of the reasons behind that, I'm sure, is the fact that climate science to a certain extent does remain controversial, at least on a political level. Why do you think that is?
Because people don't like change. We're very good at it as a species. You get a new mobile phone, you hate it for like the first half an hour, and then suddenly you adapt to it. I remember in London, the congestion zone charge. They're going to charge people to come into London. This was the end of Western civilization. And guess what? The day after it came in, nothing changed. So we're very good at adapting, but we don't like it. The second thing is you have to remember that the world is run on fossil fuels. So at the moment, if we look at the energy we use around the world, 80% of it comes from fossil fuels. Now, you're going to say to me, well, hang on, what about all this huge amounts of renewable energy we're putting in every single year? Brilliant, yes, but that is eating up the increase. Right. We're not taking away from that baseline. And so therefore, fundamentals of most countries is that the fossil fuel industry drives the energy and therefore their economy. And there are certain countries that are fully reliant on fossil fuel for all their earnings. So therefore, they're going to make sure that that carries on. Because if they suddenly go out of business and there's no oil or there's no gas being bought, then their countries are going to suffer. And so there is an incentive to actually keep the status quo going, even though those countries know that it's doing long-term damage. And I also think there's this political thing, which is sort of like, there's this sort of almost macho, driving for oil and sort of like digging and drill, baby drill, as Donald Trump says, is something really macho, and therefore it's something you can get behind. Whereas having all this incredible new technology, solar panels, wind, tidal, etc., doesn't have the same sort of like appeal. And for me, what's really frustrating is that the world is using energy from the century. Burning stuff is deeply inefficient. Whereas we have all this 21st century technology that we should be using. I'll give you an example. If the UK could convert 100% to electricity, okay? We'll leave out some of the difficult bits, sort of like concrete and things like that. But most of us, if we converted everything to electricity, we would save 40% of our energy usage. because
And is that just
electricity...
from waste and the waste of energy?
Yes. So I'll give you an example. A petrol car wastes about 60 to 70% of its energy, just because burning stuff is just really inefficient, whereas a electric car wastes about 20%. Huge difference. It's because you're cutting out the middle person. Remember, most of the fossil fuels that we're using and burning in the UK is to make electricity. So, we have these gas-fired power stations just to burn, to heat up water, to drive turbines, to generate electricity so we can light our houses and listen to wonderful podcasts like yours.
Now, one of the things that arises from that, because we do talk a lot about the technological solutions that are actually available, about the current energy system and how it works and its inefficiencies. How do you think we should go about changing the way people think about this? Because from our conversation, it's fairly clear that the likelihood of us sticking within the boundaries of the Paris Agreement is becoming increasingly unlikely. So what can we actually do? Are there things... What is it? Is it policy? Is it technology? Is it economics? Is it perception? What can we actually do to make a difference?
So I think the first thing we should remember is the transition is already happening, okay? This isn't something that has to start. It's already here. You're seeing that there's no coal that's burnt in the UK, and renewables are expanding massively in the UK. For example, the previous government were highly successful in driving the demand for offshore wind. We see in the US, the demand for renewable energy is rocketing, even though there's that rhetoric which is, yeah, you should burn coal. No, it's expensive and dirty, and companies are going, yeah, okay, we'll just go and do the renewables. So the transition here, but the problem is it's not fast enough. And
Right.
I think it was Simon Sharp book, which, strange enough, as much as I love the book, you only need the title, which is 5 times faster. Again,
Right.
everything is going really fast. We have exponential growth in solar, wind, batteries, electric vehicles, but we need to do it 5 times faster. Because what we're trying to do is take a global economy of about $100 trillion per year, which is predicated on a fossil fuel energy base, and move all of it to renewables within 2.5 decades. Now, again, most transitions take a little
longer.
bit more time than that, but we have the technology. What we have to do now is, I think, point out to politicians and policymakers that these are short-term wins. They're not long-term. They're not the next government. They're not sort of like futuristic. They are now. So, for example, had 10 years ago the UK government taken renewables seriously, the cost of living crisis that we all suffered through, because the rocketing price of natural gas, because of the invasion of Ukraine, would not have happened, because we'd gone, yeah, guess what? Again,
We don't need that gas.
We don't use the gas. I'm sorry that other people are suffering. So again, we need to move the dial where we have to talk to politicians about energy security. We have to talk about sort of like the impacts of climate change. We also then have to talk about the positives, which is if people change their lifestyle, we have a much better future. So for example, I always talk about what can individuals do? Move to a more plant-based diet. Now, I don't say go vegan and I don't say go vegetarian. I say move to a more plant-based diet. One, because it's much healthier for you. And so therefore you're going to live longer, and also you're going to cost the health service a lot less. Excellent. That's good for government. That's good for us. It's good for you. But also you're going to reduce the amount of carbon emitted on your behalf for your food. So it's these win-win situations which I think are incredibly important that the public needs to be aware of. And I think that is a job that we need to do, which is to show people 20 years in the future, guess what? Life will look exactly the same as now, except if we do it properly, there won't be any air pollution in the country. And guess what? Your homes will actually be heated and cooled properly, and you have wonderful electric transport to actually zoom down to your sort of like local shop, etc., which will have lots of healthy food. Of course, there'll be the naughty stuff that you and I love, etc. You can always have, because you can always treat yourself. That's fine. But your basic diet is very healthy and your kids are really healthy. They can walk to the local school without worrying about sort of like getting asthma from air pollution. So it's that weird thing of trying to show people the future. It's the same as now, but just better and a little bit brighter and a little bit cleaner and a lot healthier. And that's a really difficult sell.
Well, the thing is, the way it comes across to me is it's not simply a question of it being a difficult sell, because I think it is, but it's the reasons it's a difficult sell. Because people don't understand how something can transition from one thing to the next state. There doesn't seem to be a clear pathway, especially when you have an awful lot of people talking about how expensive action is, how acting on climate change is a distraction from the cost of living crisis or from immigration. So it becomes a sort of political football. And there's a lot of people out there talking about how it is expensive and difficult. And, I heard a podcast the other day, which will remain nameless, where somebody was talking about how, if we started implementing all of these decarbonisation technologies, we'd all end up with no cars and living in the Stone Age. And I thought, that's not actually true, nor is it helpful, but it's quite a popular position. How do we get the messaging right?
Well, I think the biggest problem is that it's become a polarized debate. It's the environment and looking after our environment has seemed to be a more left-wing thing to do.
Right.
It's anti-business, it's anti-sort of like growth, etc., as opposed to sort of like let companies do whatever they want. And I think this is a legacy of neoliberalism. So in the 1980s, we had that shift away from social democracies towards more liberal and open economies. And that has basically driven the whole generation that think that markets know best, government regulation is bad. And we're only starting to come out of that. We have some fantastic new female economists like Mariana Mazzucato and Kate Raworth are basically going, do you know what? The governments are the ones that keep the wheels on and actually look after
fund
the
innovation.
Economy. Exactly. I mean, Mariana Mazzucato's fantastic stuff showing that all the massive inventions like the internet,
it's a great book,
fusion, the mobile phone, etc., all came from government sort of like backed subsidies or research grants in the first place. Again, something I point out to people is that why were we able to produce a vaccination for COVID within 6 months was because governments in the Western world had been funding medical research, sometimes blue skies, from the 90s onwards. Mm-hmm. Now, sometimes if the public knew how much was going, hey, that's a waste of money. No, because when it's needed, it's already there, and then it was able to operationalize within 6 months.
I think maybe that's actually a really important point. It's about what you're choosing to spend when, because I know there's been discussions in LA of, programs for getting rid of underbrush and things not being funded because they were considered expensive. And the current cost estimates, I think, are around 50 billion in LA. So maybe it is about, framing things over the longer term and understanding the different trade-offs that we're being asked to make.
I think it's very difficult because people and politicians are very short-termists. They want long-term. So, for example, if we look about getting on a train, say London to Bristol, wow, that's really quick, very efficient. Yes, it's because the Victorians basically built a straight railway line and went through mountains and went through sort of like hills, and over rivers, etc., straight line, fast. But we don't go, oh, I'm so glad they invested in this, because you don't think of that. So I think that's one of the problems that we have as humans. We're very short term. And I'll give you an example, not just the LA sort of wildfires, but we go back to Hurricane Katrina in 2005. The upgrade of the levees would have spent about $500 million to $1 billion to upgrade them perfectly and made sure that the city was perfectly protected. Yeah, no one's going to spend that money. But the cost was $6 billion
Yeah.
Nearly 2,000 people lost their lives, and many tens of thousands never, ever were rehoused and never came back. Huge cost. However, of course, when the president, George W. Bush, flew in to this disaster area and stepped off the helicopter and go, I will pledge money to rebuild this city, his rating went up by 15%. So it's a problem, which is like, hang on, if you just had invested properly, we wouldn't have this issue, but then you wouldn't have the rating increase. So we have this weird sort of like relationship between crisis and popularity as well, which doesn't help.
That's really, really problematic.
Yes. Because again, no politician gets any credit for preventing a disaster that people never see.
Of course.
I mean, do politicians get any sort of like benefit from having built the Thames barrier?
No.
In sort of like opened in the 1980s. It took them 20 years to design, and beautifully over-designed, by the way. I love the fact that it was on purpose over-designed by the scientists. Oh, we definitely need this, which now protects us from sort of like a 1-in-1,000-year storm. But they don't get any credit for that. It's just like, well, that's what you're supposed to do, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I actually remember hearing about the Thames Barrier and the fact that when it was built, they were expecting it to be used to prevent flooding in the Thames about once a year. Last year, it was used 28 times.
Yes.
You know, so it's actually making a huge difference. And as you say, nobody gets any credit for it. Nobody can stand there and say, look what a wonderful thing I did, because nobody who lives in London realises how close they came to being flooded.
For example, investing in the sewage system of London. Which revolutionized the city, prevented cholera, prevented many diseases, and made London a modern city. And then every other city copied it. Yeah, at the time, there was so much, and I would say this, bitching about the cost. Okay, you know, I'm sure there's something better we could be spending on it. And again, that's always about infrastructure. And the interesting thing about climate change is it is now an engineering problem. It isn't climate science. We know the science. We know what's happening. We know all the impacts. It is now about building stuff. It's about building better infrastructure to protect people. It's about building better buildings that have a lower carbon footprint, but also keep people warm and cool. It's about building the renewable energy structures we need to be able to actually get the energy that we require, because every country's energy demand is growing. And this, I think, is probably the greatest challenge, is that by 2050, the global demand in energy will at least double, if not triple. So when I said to you, hey, 80% of the world's energy now is fossil fuel, and we have to make that all renewable, yes, by 2050, it means that we have to make 180% of today's energy, if not 280% of today's energy, actually renewable. But guess what? Guess what? That's a huge, huge prize, because we spend something like $3 trillion. That's more than the GDP of the United Kingdom, sixth richest country in the world, on energy infrastructure per year. So it's not like you're not going to make a profit.
I didn't know it was that much.
Building. Oh, yes, because every country in the world is building more and more energy. Because remember, we still have 1 billion people that do not have access to clean water. We have at least 1 billion that don't have any access to electricity. And we still have 825 million people that go to bed feeling hungry every night due to lack of food.
Yeah, I mean, it is terrifying when you consider the allocation of the resources we've got and how unequal they are. One of the things that I think is interesting when you talk about the potential in the energy market and how it can be actually seen as an opportunity, I think the IEA came out with a report very recently where they talked about expecting that the energy demand from data centers alone to double to 2% of the global energy market by the end of next year. And I read that statistic and I went, wow, you know, it is really quite overwhelming.
Because AI is incredibly hungry when it comes to A, computational, and B, the amount of energy it needs to actually do those computations. And that's interesting because AI is seen as a possible threat to humanity, but also a possible savior. And it's interesting because I gave a talk recently in Seoul in South Korea on climate change and AI. And one of the things I always turn around to people really don't get this. I go, AI is stupid. Okay, AI is only good as the data you put in and the questions you ask. It will give you great answers, but you have to know what you're asking first.
Yeah.
So AI will be really helpful in designing renewable energy grids for countries to make sure that all that disparate energy that comes in from different sources at different times of day is then stored in batteries, stored in sort of like hydroelectric dams, can all be matched and made really efficient if you ask it the right question, if you give it the right data. Otherwise, junk in, junk out, or garbage in, garbage out.
I suppose that's the difference between knowledge and information. Because one of the things, when we're talking about climate science, from our conversation, it's very clear to me that climate science is well understood, well established. It makes sense. We understand how it's going to work. We understand what impacts are going to come, and we understand how much worse they're going to get degree by degree. There are arguments about it still, but they come from a place of politics and of bias, potentially, as we discussed this issue of crisis and ratings. The things that with climate science tells us we need to do are perhaps not sexy and exciting, because they are about engineering and about adaptation, but that we have not just the technology and the solutions to solve the decarbonization problem, but we've got tools like AI, which, while energy intensive, can help us design better infrastructure so that we actually do have a system that could solve the problem if we do things in the right way. Is that what we've talked about?
Yes. So the key thing is, as I always say, we have the science, we have the technology, we have the entrepreneurs, and we've got the business leaders. What we don't have is the policies fit for the 21st century to deal with those issues. And we don't, in most countries, have politicians that actually get it and can then work on that. It's strange. It's almost like we want to go back to the Victorian period where the politicians were like, we build infrastructure. This is what we do. We're going to build the railways. This is important. We're going to build this. We need to actually develop this. We need that sort of viewpoint. And again, high-speed rail. Again, we can build that across continents if we wanted to, because it's cheaper, quicker, and faster than using aeroplanes. Again, I just set up the UCL Center for Sustainable Aviation. Why? Because there's so many ways that we could work with the aviation industry now to save the amount of fuel that they're using, to reduce the amount of pollution they're creating, if they took it seriously and started to go, okay, this is part of our mandate. How do we actually make sure that we become part of the solution and we can be more sustainable? And once that happens in organizations, it starts to snowball. It starts to actually infect all of the company. And it's really interesting to watch when that happens.
So that brings me to one of the things that always comes up in these conversations, which is what can people do? Because we know what's happening with states. We know that companies are doing various different things. We've got investors, but everybody wants to know what is it they can do to make the difference. And from the sounds of things, we need to vote for different politicians and we need to actually campaign for change, because actually consumers do have a voice. What do you think people should do really to affect change?
So the first thing is talk about it. It's very strange. This is the greatest threat to humanity, and we don't talk about it. We'll go down the pub and we'll talk about football and we'll talk about sort of like Trump being elected, but we won't talk about the elephant in the room, which is, hey, did you know this is the mildest winter we've ever had type thing? So again, I think talking about it's really important. I think it's important for many reasons. One, because a lot of people suffer from climate and environmental anxiety.
Mm-hmm.
And many of them suffer in silence because they think they're the only ones. And it's really interesting that when people start to talk, they realize that everybody else feels like that. So therefore, it's a shared emotion. It's also then when that happens, people catalyze things, whether it happens to be in your sports club or at work or where you worship, etc. When people get together and talk, then lots of little things that you can do as a community which make a difference, not just for the local environment, but also to your well-being. So I think, and I'm going to quote sort of Catherine Hayhoe, which is talking about it is the most powerful thing you can do. And then, of course, there's that wonderful wish list, which is, of course, I then go to things like, well, look, move to a more plant-based diet. It's basically what you want to do anyway. I know it's difficult. Hey, it's New Year. So guess what? Put it as one of your resolutions, be healthier, be fitter, combine it with exercise, of course. We can then think about, well, hang on, how do I get my energy? Can I move to a renewable supplier? Can I actually move to an electric car? If and when I can afford it, does it make sense for me? So you start thinking about these things through. You then start to think, well, hang on, when I actually buy something, I'm going to have a look and say, well, hang on, is there something that's slightly more sustainable? For example, I am currently wearing a jumper, which is merino wool, which is by a wonderful company called Sheep Inc. And guess what? It's carbon negative. And the thing is that top line is quality, and then after that, you say, well, look, but we're also not damaging the planet. So you can start to see things. Now, of course, these are the companies that always get most criticism. But guess what? If everybody moved their hard-earned pounds and dollars to companies saying they're sustainable, everybody else has to move. And I think that's the interesting thing is remember that the money in your pocket is really powerful. Again, moving banks. You can suddenly move banks because you're able to a more sustainable bank. So it's thinking these things through. And if everybody does it, suddenly the whole system shifts. And of course, yes, if you're in a country that you are lucky enough to be able to vote, then vote for politicians that have a more long-term view, actually have a view of looking after you as a person, not just rhetoric about the country being great again. And also feel free in countries where you're safe to protest, make your voice heard, because as someone said, all of the freedoms that we have, whether it happens to be sort of like women's vote, gay rights, trans rights, the 5-day working week, the 8-hour working day, all of those have been protests. They have been about people going out and say, this is important, this matters. And unfortunately, in some of those cases, quite a few, people have lost their lives because they have wanted and demanded a better world. And so therefore, I hope that we don't get to that stage. But again, people protesting. We've seen this, particularly I've seen with politicians, the youth, when they did Fridays for Future, and they would go once a month, they go on strike, etc., and then go into cities, etc., protesting. That resonates. Because this isn't just some hippies complaining. This is just normal kids going, you've mucked it up, guys. Please, could you actually fix it? And by the way, I use guys because it's usually men who are in control and doing most of the rubbish decisions.
Well, I think on that note, I will draw our conversation to a close because I think, you've put it beautifully that what we're talking about and what we need is this momentum for change in whatever way we can find to drive that forward. One of the things that I think is so important is we tend as a general rule to stick in silos, to talk about one thing at a time. And actually, the point about action on climate change is you actually need to cross those silos and talk about how all these different areas are interconnected, which is exactly what we've done. So I've thoroughly enjoyed it.
I mean, I agree. I think that we need a much more holistic approach to solving some of the world's problems. And I sum it up for my students. My students, I say there are 4 major issues that we have to deal with in the 21st century. The first one, of course, because it's closest to my heart, climate change. But then there's all the environmental degradation that's going on, the loss of biodiversity, the destruction of rainforests, destruction of sort of like the Tigre in sort of like the Siberian Arctic, etc. All of those are really essential. But on top of that, we have to deal with global inequality and these huge issues of poverty around the world and global security, because the era of peace and prosperity of the 1990s and early 2000s is clearly over. The problem is that all four of those are interlinked. Because if climate change increases markedly, then you get more refugees, more migration, which affects global security and increases poverty. So the problem is that you have to solve all of them at the same time, holistically, and make sure that your solutions don't make any of the other ones worse. So for me, it's about seeing the world as a place where there will be 10 billion people by 2050, and we should work out in the next 25 years, how can we give most of them the best life possible?
Well, I think that's an incredibly positive note to end our conversation on. Thank you so much for joining me today. And to our listeners, I hope you have enjoyed yourselves and learned some things about what we can do to help make the world a better place to live. We will be back at Shaken Not Burned with the next episode soon.